Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
What I want to talk about is really not so as much about children as about the policymaking process and how Shorstart worked in terms of the policymaking process. You know, I think we're very sneery right now about New Labour, and I want to reclaim some of the territory and some of the hope that was in place in 1997. And I'll just give you a preview to say that I will end with some of the achievements that were responsible for that hope. 1997 manifesto. A commitment to free early education for all 4 years. I think we forget that before 1997, we didn't have free nursery education for everyone. It was up to local authorities. So there was a commitment to, within the Parliament, establish free early education for all 4-year-olds, a commitment to set a target for free early education for all 3-year-olds before the end of the Parliament. There was a commitment to the National Childcare Strategy. And as Jane Wolfogel so eloquently explains in her book, Britain's War on Poverty, that the Americans had a very, very strong welfare to work policy, but they didn't understand that to make welfare to work, you need childcare. The Brits understood that you needed both childcare and employment and benefits changes to make welfare to work. There wasn't a big push on child poverty before the election. The big push was on welfare to work policies, early education, and then a small bit on these pilots. And there certainly wasn't a notion about Shorstart before the election. Post-election comes the comprehensive spending review process, and a bright spark in the Treasury said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we did some comprehensive reviews that cut across all of government? This was, again, consistent with the modernizing agenda that government departments needed to work better together. And the best place to bring them together was through the Treasury process. So there was one on drugs, there was one on juvenile justice, and there was one on services for children under 8. And the comprehensive spending review on services for children under 8, it said, surprise, surprise, poverty is bad for children. But the really important part was that poverty is worse for children in the early years. So a family living in poverty for 2 years when the child is between 0 and 4 has longer term impact on children than a family living in poverty for 2 years when the child is 14 to 16. For example, much longer term impact. It found that most public expenditure on children under 8 was spent on school-aged children. That there wasn't much government spending on children under 4, and that there were several departments involved in services for very young children, but none of them talked to each other. So there was a significant amount of money being spent, but nobody knew what it was for. There was no overarching strategy. There was a wide difference in both quality and quantity of early years services across the country, patchy quality, patchy quantity, because it was up to local authorities, and that the right kind of services could narrow the gap between poor children and the rest. So out of that review, Shorstart was born. But there were some really key features of the way Shorstart was set up, and this was very contentious, that really was about the modernizing agenda. So it was meant to be user, not provider-led, run by the people who actually use the services, flexible and responsive to local needs. Well, it's funny to set up a program that would be inflexible and unresponsive. Joined up across different agencies and professions, that was quite new. A focus on outcomes, not inputs. And people forget that about Shorstart. The reason that local programs could do what they wanted is because we had our own public service agreement, which defined a certain number of outcomes, but said, actually, because things were so different at local level, if you defined too closely the program, then you'd have everybody doing the wrong thing. And finally, the most contentious thing was evidence-based. And this was the real shocker for me when I wrote the book, because in fact, of course, the needs of young children were very, very well evidenced, but the way in which we set up the program wasn't. The program design bore no resemblance to the American programs that they looked at, that they knew worked. The other big innovation in Shorstart was the innovation in governance. So if there were parliamentary questions about Sure Start, they would be answered in education time by a health minister. And at the time, I have to say, I thought, gee, is this really going to change the lives of poor children? But in fact, those innovations are really, really important in terms of helping civil servants to think differently. So I was rather naive about asking those questions. I think those innovations were important, but I think the way it was emphasized, you know, if you come in new and you have no idea how it was done before, you don't understand how radical that is. But the idea that a health minister answers questions in education time was at the time extraordinary radical. At local level, it was radical as well. There was a lead body to plan and organize the programs. There was an accountable body to hold the money. And the point was that you wanted those to be different because you didn't want the people holding the money to make all the decisions. So it was really important to separate out a lead body from an accountable body. And there was a partnership board including all the key agencies locally and including local parents. So the big debates. Well, I've already said a bit about the big debate about program design. And basically, the academics were very, very keen on a manualized, standardized program, and everyone else was against it. The problem with having a system where it's locally decided what you do to achieve the outcomes is that the inputs would all be different, which meant that we couldn't have a randomized control trial. So there was a huge debate about whether there should be a randomized control trial. But once you decide on different inputs everywhere, there's no point in having a randomized control trial because the inputs have to be identical for a randomized control trial to work. The other reason why we couldn't have it is that ministers just wouldn't allow it. There was a big debate about the rate of expansion. So we had 250 programs allocated in terms of funding. There were probably 6 that were doing anything, and along comes the next spending review, and ministers want to double the size of the program. I was very against it. All the officials were against it. All the academics were against it. Ministers said we're doing it, and I have to say they were right and we were wrong. Because had we not expanded the program, there'd be no Sure Start today. Yeah. But there was a cost to it. There were big debates about the cross-government arrangements. We moved from being linked to Department of Health to linked to DWP. Linked to that was the debate about the employability agenda. There was a huge resistance on the part of some to the employability agenda. I still believe, again, I still believe the best way not to be poor is to have a job. And I believe that there was in the community development approach an incentive not to encourage people to work. I know that sounds very cynical, but I've been there, you know, and basically, who's going to come to my aromatherapy session on Tuesday at 2 o'clock if they have a job? You know, and there was a sort of collusive relationship between the community and the people, the community and the staff that was about, they love it, they love me, they're happy, they come, they enjoy it. And then a minister comes down and these women say, oh, it changed my life, it's the most wonderful thing that ever happened. So everybody's happy, but people are still poor. And I think that's still a problem with children's centers. I think that's still an issue. And the really big debate was the handover to local authorities. I felt once you have Every Child Matters, once you have directors of children's services, you couldn't have them in charge of all outcomes for children except the 600 on that poor estate. But we lost a lot. We lost the community development approach. We lost, I mean, this is when whoever writes the checks makes the decisions, and we lost a lot by handing it over. But again, I think building it as part of the system was the right thing to do. And the biggest debate, which again is still a key debate in government, was all children, poor children, dysfunctional families. And I worry now that the government is going too much back to the language of the most needy. Sure Start was not about the most dysfunctional families. It was about people who didn't have money. And that's different. So what did we achieve? I think the biggest thing we achieved is that there were 3 manifestos in the election in 2010, and all of them supported early years provision. They call it now the foundation years. I don't care what they call it banana. But there isn't a debate anymore that government has a role to play between when children are born and when they go to school. And that, to me, is the most phenomenal achievement. That debate is over with. A publicly funded, universal preschool service has been established. And with all the government cuts, 15 hours a week, all 3 and 4-year-olds is still in place. 9 months paid maternity leave is still in place. Congratulate them. Tell them they're wonderful. Keep telling them it's a fantastic thing that they've kept this. Don't remind them that Labor did it, because it will be harder for them to take it away if we tell them how great it is. And it is great. Ministers change and policies evolve. They all had a different think bubble, but that meant that the program evolved, and it was an iterative process, and I think that was a good thing. Cross-government policies need to make explicit the tensions. People in Whitehall are too polite. They won't disagree. They will draft and draft and draft till they come to a form of words everybody agrees with, and it's meaningless because they haven't had the argument about what policy, is it about childcare? Is it about education? Is it about flexibility? It's about having that debate in an open and clear way, being willing to disagree, and then giving ministers the choices. But there's too much politeness, there's too much civility, and it means we don't, that policies fudge the big issues. I think that one of the things that we achieved in Shorestart, when people say it changed, is that it changed because we were learning as we went along, and I think that ministers held their nerve. They didn't stop the program. They changed it according to what we were learning as we were going along. I think that was a really good thing. And it wouldn't have happened without ministers that wanted it to happen. It was not something that people were voting on, but now it is, and that's an achievement.
The one thing you didn't talk about, Naomi, at all was actually the evaluation of Shorestart, which has been mixed, I think. So I wonder whether you could kind of share with us what the headlines of those. They were huge evaluation studies. I mean, the biggest evaluation studies ever undertaken.
Yeah. So the headlines are, I'm just going to do the outcome stuff. 2005, we got mixed results, poor results for teen parents, good results for everybody else. The poor results on teen parents were particularly important because it wasn't that it wasn't having an effect, it's that they were doing less well than teen parents in non-Shorestart areas. And the first, the most important thing on an intervention is do no harm. It looked like we were doing harm to teen parents, and that was an enormously worrying finding. So a lot of work was done between that 2005 finding and then findings in 2007 about outreach and why was this happening. And it would take too long to describe why it was happening, but the point is, this is what I meant about they held their nerve and we learned as we went along, and 2007 results, which got no publicity at all, were very, very good. We had good social outcomes for children, good social outcomes for parents, better home learning environment, and the really interesting thing was no difference in the subgroups, no difference between teen parents, no difference between poorest and poor. The whole thing about, middle-class families taking over, the evaluation found that in the whole set, they were about on the poverty line. The teen parents were 10 quid a week below the poverty line. Non-teen parents were just above the poverty line. It was about the poor and the poorest. And Shorestart was reaching the poor but failing the poorest in 2005. By 2007, those results had those differences had completely disappeared. We had very good results. 2010, we had very, very good adult results. Better home learning environment, more employed people in Shorestart areas. So better employability, better satisfaction, and less harsh parenting. We got no cognitive results from the children. And I think the no cognitive results, I don't mean to be defensive about this, was because by then there weren't the differences between the Shorestart children and the non-Shorestart children because universal preschool education was universally taken up. So all the kids were getting a reasonably good early years experience, and the difference Shorestart was making was to the adults, to the parents.
Do you think that paradoxically, one of the problems for Shorestart in terms of the perception, which is quite widespread, that it has underperformed in terms of outcomes, is that in order to get politicians to be as brave as they were to create this, one of the reasons politicians do that is because they believe you can transform outcomes. And actually, one thing if you have studied the area, is you don't achieve transformations. If you achieve 2 or 3% improvements, you've done pretty well. It's value for money in social policy terms. So do you think that the enthusiasm that drove the process is part of what is kind of slightly undermining its reputation, because it was driven by the possibility of transformation, and when people see the results and see there isn't transformation, they go, oh, it's failed.
I think that's right. I think there was over expectation, but I also think in part it didn't perform as well as it could have, and that was because of the fast rollout. Would we have made fewer mistakes had it been more, had we done it more slowly and more, with a better attention to quality, with better support for the program managers? Yeah, I think we would have done better. On the other hand, it wouldn't exist today. And that's a trade-off. What I think we have now is an infrastructure, and the big challenge now is to make it better. It's not as good as it could be. But you're right, effect size is important.
You assert at the end that the great success is that there will be no turning back the clock in terms of the importance of early years. But actually, interestingly, in the kind of neuroscience community, there is a bit of a kind of turn against this in favor of a view of the plasticity of children's brains, and a sense that actually it is easier to overcome damage in early years than we had previously thought. The idea that your brain is fixed by 3 and that's your destiny is being challenged in all sorts of ways. There's, for example, the study of Romanian orphans, which shows a remarkable recovery from children who experience levels of deprivation off the scale. So do you think that there may be a turn against the notion of early years as being as kind of crucially important as it was assumed when Sure Start was created?
I've always said never too early, never too late. I've never ascribed personally to the view that it's all over by 3 or 5 or 12 or 30 or 60. I just don't believe that about human beings. And I think it's useless in terms of social policy to believe that. But what we were trying to do is rebalance the investment. And the truth is, James Heckman won a Nobel Prize for the economic evaluation. The fact is, it's easier and cheaper and more likely to work the younger the child is. But it doesn't mean it can never be remedied. It's harder, and it's less likely to work, and it's more expensive. But I don't believe that it's over. I just don't think you can give up on children. And just look at what we spend on schools. And look at what we used to spend on universities.